Before we begin tonight, I want to say thank you to Scott who sent this idea. And while you're getting settled, if you're listening on Spotify, a review takes about 10 seconds. Then close your eyes and forget you ever did it. Now, get comfortable. Turn the lights down or off. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench, because it is probably clenched, and let your hands go loose and heavy wherever they are resting. Tonight we're going to talk about glass. Coloured glass. Violet glass mostly. Small rectangular screens, no larger than a paperback book, filled with a chemical solution that turned the light passing through them a deep and unnatural blue-violet. They were made by a British physician more than 100 years ago, and he genuinely believed they would change medicine forever. He believed that if you looked through them, you could see the atmosphere that surrounds the human body, a faint light, a haze, something living and visible clinging to the skin of every person alive. Mainstream science looked at his work and shrugged and moved on. But there is another version of this story, a quieter one, and in that version the doctor did not stop his research because he was laughed at. He stopped because when he made the glass stronger, he saw something else, something that was not a person, something that had been standing in the room the entire time. So let us start in London in the winter more than a century ago, in a small bedroom on the upper floor of a house where a young woman had been sick for 11 days. The year is 1912. The room smells of camphor and coal smoke and the particular sourness of a body that has been fighting something for too long. There is a single lamp burning low on the dresser, because the physician has asked for the light to be reduced. The curtains are drawn, the fire has been allowed to die down to embers, and the cold is beginning to creep back in along the floorboards. Doctor Walter John Kilner is 65 years old. He is a serious man, an electrician by training as much as a physician, a specialist who spent decades at St Thomas Hospital, working with electrical treatments, in an age when electricity itself still felt faintly miraculous. He has a beard going grey. He has spectacles. He has the particular tiredness of a man who has spent his life looking at sick people and losing more of them than he saved. And in his hands he holds a wooden frame, and inside that frame are 2 panes of glass, and between those panes is a thin layer of dye. The solution is called dicyanin. It is a coal tar derivative, one of the strange new synthetic dyes that came out of German chemistry in the 1800s. The same family of compounds that gave the world its first bright artificial colours. In the frame, it looks almost black. Hold it toward the lamp and it blooms into a deep violet, the colour of a bruise, the colour of the sky about 15 minutes after the sun has fully gone. Kilner has learned that if a person sits in darkness for a while, and then looks at a bright light through this glass, and then turns to look at a human being in dim light, something changes in the way the eye behaves. The world goes strange and grainy and low. Contrast shifts, edges swim. And around the human body a border appears. He has documented it hundreds of times by now. A narrow band of light hugging the skin, perhaps a quarter of an inch wide. Beyond that, a broader haze, extending several inches out, softer, more diffuse, its shape changing with the health and mood and age of the person. He has seen it thin and ragged over a diseased lung. He has seen it flare and brighten around a woman in the early stages of pregnancy. He has watched it collapse inward, close to the body, in the hours before a death. He is convinced it is real. He is convinced it is physical, not spiritual. He is convinced it is a diagnostic tool, and that within a decade every hospital in Britain will have a set of these screens hanging by the door. He will be wrong about that, but not for the reason he expects. Tonight the young woman in the bed is not doing well. Her fever has broken twice and returned twice. Her family has stopped asking hopeful questions. Kilner sits beside the bed in the near dark, lets his eyes adjust and raises the violet screen. The room drains of colour. Everything becomes soft and blue and slightly unreal, the way a room looks in a dream where you know you are dreaming. The furniture loses its detail. The lamp becomes a smear, and around the young woman the familiar haze appears, thin, uneven, pulled tight against her body along the left side, which is where the trouble is. Kilner leans forward slightly, examining the edge of it, noting how it frays near her shoulder, and then the haze moves. Not the way it moves when a patient breathes, not the slow drift he has recorded 1,000 times. It moves the way water moves when something displaces it. It bends, it parts, it flows around something standing between Kilner and the far wall. Something tall, something narrow. It is not glowing. That is the detail he will write down 3 times in his notes, underlined, as though he is arguing with himself about it. It does not shine. It does not shimmer. It is not made of light at all. It is visible only because the light around it has to go somewhere else. A shape like a person who has been stretched, standing perfectly still on the far side of the bed, in the space between the bed frame and the window, in a gap perhaps 18 inches wide where no adult human being could comfortably stand. Its head is tilted. Not tilted in curiosity the way a dog tilts its head. Tilted the way a thing tilts when it has no neck and no muscles, and is simply oriented at an angle, permanently, because that is the angle it has. And it is oriented toward the bed. Kilner does not move for what he later estimates was 20 seconds. He is a scientist. He is 65 years old, and he has been staring at optical illusions and afterimages and retinal artifacts for years, and every part of his training tells him that his eyes have been sitting in the dark too long, and have begun inventing structure out of nothing. So he does the only correct thing. He lowers the screen. Colour comes back into the room. The lamp becomes a lamp. The wallpaper becomes wallpaper. Faded roses on a cream ground. The gap between the bed and the window is empty. There is a chair there, and a folded blanket on the chair, and nothing else. He lets out a breath. Then he raises the screen again. It is still there. It has not moved. It has not changed. It stands exactly where it stood, in the same impossible narrow space, with its head at the same tilted angle, and Kilner has the sudden and entirely unscientific certainty that the difference between the two views is not that the thing appeared. The difference is that when he lowered the glass, he simply lost the ability to see what was already in the room. He's still holding the screen up when the young woman opens her eyes. She does not look at him. She looks past him, or rather she looks toward the window, toward the narrow gap, and her expression is not fear exactly. It is exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been dealing with an ongoing irritation for a long time, and has finally decided to complain about it. Her voice is thin and dry, and she says, "Why has that man been watching me all night?" Kilner puts the screen down. He does not raise it again. He packs his instruments, tells the family that she's comfortable, walks down the stairs and out into the London cold, and stands on the pavement for a long moment in the yellow fog with his hand flat against the front of his coat, like a man checking whether his heart is still working. The young woman died 4 days later, and Doctor Walter John Kilner went home and began keeping a second notebook. To understand why that notebook matters, you need to understand who Kilner was, and why the story of the violet glass is not the story of a crank. He was not a mystic. That is the first thing that surprises people. He was not a spiritualist, not a table rapper, not one of the many Victorian gentlemen who spent their evenings in darkened parlours, holding hands with strangers and asking the dead to knock twice. London was full of those men in his lifetime. Kilner was not one of them, and he was openly irritated by them. He was a hospital man. He trained at Cambridge and at St Thomas, and he ran the electrotherapy department there for more than 20 years, back when electrotherapy meant careful, cautious, deeply serious work with currents and coils, and the still half-understood behaviour of electricity inside living tissue. He wrote papers. He kept meticulous records. He believed, the way many good physicians of his era believed, that the human body was a machine that had not yet been fully mapped, and that new instruments would keep revealing new territory, the way the microscope had revealed a universe in a drop of pond water, and the way the X-ray, discovered when Kilner was in his late 40s, had suddenly and casually made human bones visible through skin. That last one matters enormously. Try to sit inside that for a moment, because it is easy to look back and laugh, and much harder to remember what it actually felt like. In 1895, a German physicist noticed that a screen in his laboratory glowed when it should not have. Within a year, doctors across Europe were photographing the insides of living people. A form of light that no human eye had ever detected, that had been passing through everyone in every room in every century of human history, had simply been sitting there, invisible, waiting. Nobody had known. Nobody could have known. There was no way to know, until suddenly there was. So when Kilner began to wonder whether there might be something else the eye was failing to register, he was not being superstitious. He was being, by the standards of his moment, extremely reasonable. The invisible had just been proven to exist. The only question was how much more of it there might be. His approach was straightforward. If the human retina is limited, perhaps it can be temporarily retuned. Perhaps a filter that removes most of the visible spectrum will force the eye to work harder in the narrow band that remains, and perhaps at the edges of that band there is information the brain normally discards as noise. So he made screens, panes of glass with dye solutions sealed between them. He tried many compounds. Dicyanin worked best. The procedure he settled on was almost a ritual, and it required patience, which is one reason so few people managed to replicate it properly afterward. The observer sits in darkness, genuinely dark, not dim for a good while, so the eye becomes hungry. Then the observer looks through the darkest of the screens at a bright light, for perhaps half a minute, not longer. This is the step that changes something in the retina and, Kilner suspected, in the way the visual cortex weighs what it is receiving. Then the observer turns to a subject standing against a plain dark background in low light and looks through a paler screen, or through no screen at all. And there, Kilner reported, it is. He divided what he saw into layers, and he was fussy about the terminology, because he wanted this to be medicine and not poetry. Closest to the skin, a very narrow dark band, almost like a shadow line, less than a quarter of an inch. Beyond that, a brighter, more defined layer following the contours of the body, a few inches wide, dense and structured. Beyond that, a broader outer haze fading gradually, sometimes extending a foot or more from the body in a healthy adult, ragged and dim in the sick and the elderly, and remarkably strong in children. He recorded that it responded to magnets. He recorded that it changed with electrical charge. He recorded that in women it was consistently broader across the hips, and that in men it hugged the frame more closely, and that at puberty it changed shape dramatically. And he built an entire diagnostic system on the idea that a physician could learn to read illness in it the way a physician reads a face. He recorded that where a person was injured, the layers distorted. Where there was inflammation, they flared. Where there was a wasting disease, they thinned and pulled inward. And that in the final hours of life they collapsed against the body and then, at some point, were simply no longer there. He wrote all of this down carefully, and in 1911 he published it as a book, The Human Atmosphere, with the subtitle The Aura Made Visible by the Aid of Chemical Screens. And that subtitle, some would later argue, was the single greatest mistake of his career, because he used the word aura. He used it in a strictly physical sense. He said so explicitly, repeatedly, almost offensively throughout the text. He was not describing a soul, he was describing a field. He compared it to the visible discharge around an electrode, not to anything spiritual. It did not matter. The word had already been claimed. It belonged to the spiritualists, to the theosophists, to the aura painters and the palm readers, and the whole enormous and fashionable Edwardian industry of the unseen. The moment it appeared on the cover of a medical book, the medical establishment stopped reading and started smiling. The reviews were polite and devastating. The British Medical Journal treated it as a curiosity. Colleagues who had respected his electrical work for 2 decades found the whole thing embarrassing on his behalf. Others tried the screens, failed to see anything, and concluded that the effect was suggestion. And here is the detail that the conspiracy hangs on, and it is worth sitting with, because it is genuinely true and not invented. Almost nobody replicated it correctly. The dye was expensive and difficult to obtain even before the First World War, and after it, when German chemical supplies were cut off from Britain, it became nearly impossible. The screens that were sold commercially in later decades were mostly not made to his formula at all. They were cheap violet glass sold to people who wanted to see auras, which is not remotely the same thing as a controlled optical filter prepared to a specific concentration, meaning that within a very short window, the actual object at the centre of this story stopped existing in any reliable form, which is, depending on how you like your stories, either an ordinary tale of a supply chain and a dead fashion, or it is exactly what you would expect to see if someone had decided that these particular pieces of glass should quietly stop being available. Kilner revised the book. He published a second edition in 1920. He softened some claims and strengthened others. He died that same year, at 73, and the medical world moved on without him, and Disyanin drifted out of hospitals and into the back rooms of occult bookshops, where it has remained ever since, sold beside crystals and incense, harmless and slightly silly. That is the public story. It is well documented. You can read the book yourself. It is not hidden. And then there is the notebook. According to the story, Kilner kept 2 records of everything. The first was the one he intended for publication. Measurements, patients, layers, distortions, all of it careful and dull and appropriate. The second was a plain-bound volume, smaller, with a cloth cover, and on the first page, in his own handwriting, a title he apparently wrote before he had filled in a single observation. Observations not fit for publication. Think about that phrasing for a moment, because it is a strange thing for a scientist to write in advance. Not observations to be verified, not preliminary notes. He titled the book with the assumption already in place that whatever went into it could never be shown to anyone. The early entries are mundane, or nearly so. They record failures, sessions where the screens produced nothing, patients who found the procedure unpleasant, a note about headaches lasting into the following day, a note about a colleague who tried the screens twice and then refused to try them a third time and would not explain why. Then, gradually, the entries change. He begins recording things that appear near patients but do not belong to patients. At first he calls them irregularities, then he calls them attached masses. Then, sometime in the winter of 1912, he abandons the clinical vocabulary entirely and simply describes them. Dark forms. He writes that they come in what appear to be several kinds, and he tries, in his methodical way, to sort them, the way he sorted the layers of the aura, because sorting things is what he knows how to do when he is frightened. The first kind are small and close. They cling to the sick. They are not separate from the patient the way a person in a room is separate. They sit against the body, usually near a wound or an infection or a failing organ, and they do not move independently. And Kilner speculates in one entry that they may not be creatures at all, but something closer to a growth, or a stain, or the visible signature of the illness itself. The second kind move. These are larger. They cross rooms, they pass through doorways, and when they do, they pass through them at slightly the wrong height, as though the floor they are walking on is not quite our floor. He observes one moving down a hospital corridor and notes with a chemist's precision that its feet were approximately 3 inches below the level of the tiles. He notes that they do not appear to notice him. That is the recurring phrase in entry after entry, and you can feel the relief in it. They do not appear to notice the observer. They do not appear to notice the observer. And then there is a third kind. They are taller. Their proportions are wrong in a way he struggles to describe, and eventually settles for describing badly. Limbs too long for the torso. A head that reads as a head only because of where it is positioned rather than because of anything on it. No features, no face. Not a blank face, he writes, which would still be a face. Nothing there for a face to be. And these, unlike the others, are still. They stand in rooms, they stand in corners, beside beds, at the ends of corridors, in the narrow spaces where furniture does not go. They do not pace, they do not drift. They occupy a position and they hold it, sometimes for the entire length of an examination. And Kilner records that on more than one occasion he returned to the same house days later and found the same figure standing in precisely the same place. He calls them the observers. And in the final third of the notebook, the phrase that had been repeating like a small prayer begins to change. They do not appear to notice the observer. Then, the tall form altered its orientation during the examination. Then, it was oriented toward me on my arrival before the screen was raised. Then, in an entry dated only by the month, in handwriting that has lost some of its careful roundness. I have come to the conclusion that they are aware of who among us has looked, and that they have begun to keep account of it. He writes that he no longer uses the screens in his own home. He writes that he has instructed his family not to enter the room where the equipment is stored. He writes, near the end, a sentence that would mean nothing at all if you found it out of context, and which is difficult to shake once you have read the rest. It is not the seeing that concerns me now. It is that seeing seems to be a door which opens on both sides, and I have been standing in it with a lamp. The notebook stops. It does not conclude. There are pages left. And Kilner spent his final years, according to this version of events, quietly discouraging other researchers from pursuing the stronger formulations, and telling anyone who asked that the effect was weaker than he had hoped, and that the whole line of inquiry had disappointed him, which the medical establishment was more than happy to believe, because it was exactly what they had been saying all along. Now let us leave 1920 behind, and the fog, and the gaslight, and the wooden cases of violet glass being packed away into cupboards. Let us come forward, all the way forward to now. Because the story does not end with a dead Edwardian doctor. Stories like this never do. They wait. Dr. Julian Rook is not a believer either. That is important, and it is the reason this part of the story has teeth. Every good version of this legend hangs on a skeptic, because a skeptic who breaks is worth 10 mystics who never doubted. Rook is an ophthalmic researcher. His field is perception, specifically the failures of perception, and even more specifically the strange category of visual experience, where the eye is healthy, and the brain is healthy, and the person is entirely sane, and still sees something that is not there. He works with patients who have Charles Bonnet syndrome, in which people losing their sight begin to see vivid, detailed, silent hallucinations, cathedrals and patterned wallpaper, and small figures in period clothing, generated by a visual cortex that has been starved of input and has begun filling the silence with invention. He works with migraine auras. He works with the strange geometric phosphines that appear under pressure on the eyeball, and with the tunnel vision and figures reported by pilots under acceleration, and with the well-documented tendency of the human visual system to generate a companion, a presence, a sense of someone standing just out of view under conditions of exhaustion and isolation and low oxygen and sensory monotony. He knows, better than almost anyone alive, how thoroughly the brain lies. So when Rook first reads about Kilner, he does what any competent researcher would do. He reads the book, finds it earnest and badly reasoned, identifies the mechanism in about an hour, and files it away. Because there is a mechanism. Kilner's procedure is, from a modern standpoint, an almost perfectly designed illusion generator. You dark adapt, which shifts the eye toward its rod system and away from colour and fine detail. Then you stare at a bright light through a saturated filter, which bleaches the pigments in one part of the retina and leaves a lingering afterimage bias across the whole visual field. Then you look at a person against a dark background in low light, which is precisely the condition under which contrast detection becomes unreliable and the edges of objects begin to smear. You will see a band around them. Everyone will. It has a name. It is called Mach banding, the way our visual system exaggerates edges, and it is why a gradient looks like it has stripes in it. The border Kilner described is almost certainly that, and the rest, the wide outer haze, the changes with health and mood, is expectation. It is a doctor who already knows the patient is dying, looking at a blurred outline in the dark, and finding the blur to be diminished. Rook could explain all of it. He has explained all of it in a lecture he gives to graduate students, in which Kilner appears as a sympathetic figure, a serious man undone by a beautiful mistake. He is comfortable with that reading for 11 years. Then a package arrives. It comes from a collector, an elderly man in Norfolk who deals in antique medical instruments, and who has read one of Rook's papers and has decided, with the particular confidence of collectors, that Rook is the correct person to have this. It is a wooden case, about the size of a shallow briefcase, dark with age, the corners reinforced with brass that has gone green. There is a paper label on the lid, foxed and yellowed, the ink faded to the colour of weak tea, and on it, in a hand that Rook will later compare against archived correspondence and find to be a match, W.J. Kilner. Screen Series C. Inside, held in fitted recesses lined with faded felt, are 3 screens. They are perfect. That is the first thing that strikes him. He has seen photographs of surviving Kilner screens, and they are almost always ruined. The seals failed, the dye leaked or dried into a crust or bleached to a pale nothing by a century of light. These are intact. The solution inside them is still liquid, still dark, still that deep and unpleasant violet that seems to absorb the room rather than colour it. 2 of them he recognises from the descriptions in the book. A dark one for the light stage, a pale one for observation. The third is not described in the book at all. It is heavier. The glass is thicker. The frame is different, made of a different wood, cut more precisely, as though it were built later and by someone with better tools. And when Rook holds it up toward a window, it does not look violet. It looks like a hole. Not black exactly. Black would be simple. It is more that the light coming through it seems to arrive with something missing from it, so that the sky beyond looks flat and wrong, like a photograph of a sky rather than a sky. There is a small mark burned into the edge of the frame, not a letter. A short vertical line with a shorter line crossing it near the top, like a stripped-down cross, or a tally, or a tree with one branch. Rook photographs everything. Then he does the correct scientific thing, which is also, in retrospect, the beginning of all of it. He sends the 3rd screen to a chemist. Dr. Nessa Calder is an analytical chemist who specialises in historical materials, pigments, dyes, varnishes, the chemistry of old things. Museums send her paintings, auction houses send her forgeries. She's precise, cheerful, and almost impossible to impress, and when Rook tells her the screen is a curiosity from an Edwardian aura experiment, she laughs and says she will have something for him in a fortnight. She calls him in 9 days, and she is not laughing. The published formula for a Kilner screen is not a secret. It is in the book. It is ditzianin in solution, in specified concentrations sealed between glass. Calder finds ditzianin in the 3rd screen, as expected, at a concentration considerably higher than anything Kilner described publicly. But there is something else in it. A metallic compound, present in a small but deliberate quantity, entirely absent from every published account, from every commercial imitation, from every recipe circulated in occult catalogues for the last century. It is not a contaminant. Contaminants are uneven. This is homogeneous, evenly distributed through the solution, added on purpose by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and when she runs the transmission spectrum she stops working for a while and simply sits with the printout. Because the screen is not a colour filter, not really. A colour filter passes a broad band of light and blocks the rest. That is what the published screens do. That is what makes them violet. This one is a notch. It blocks almost everything, aggressively, across nearly the entire visible spectrum, cutting the light down to a tiny fraction of what enters it. But in one extremely narrow region, right at the far violet edge of what the human eye can register, where sensitivity has already fallen off so steeply that most people consider it functionally invisible, it does the opposite. It passes that band cleanly, and the metallic compound appears to fluoresce, taking a portion of the energy it absorbs from elsewhere in the spectrum and re-emitting it into that same narrow band. The screen is not just letting a sliver of light through, it is concentrating light into a sliver. Calder explains it to Rook over the phone in a flat voice, as though reading a weather report. Imagine standing in a room with 100 people all shouting. You cannot pick out a whisper. Now imagine a device that silences the 99 and amplifies the 1. You would hear things that had always been said in that room. Rook asks the obvious question. What is in that band? What could possibly be in a band of light so close to the edge of vision that evolution never bothered to build for it? Calder says, in principle, nothing that matters. The band is unremarkable. It is just light. There is no reason for information to be hiding there rather than anywhere else. Then she says the thing that keeps Rook awake. Unless something is using it, unless something reflects or emits mainly in that band, and we have simply never had a reason to look, because a wavelength we cannot see is exactly as invisible to us as a wavelength that does not exist. Rook names it that night in his notes, half as a joke, the Kilner window. The name stops being a joke about 6 weeks later. He designs the experiment properly because he is a proper researcher and because a part of him wants very badly to disprove this and get back to his actual work. Ethics approval, controlled room. 3 volunteers, all screened for eye disease, all told only that they are testing a historical optical device that may produce visual artifacts. Nobody is told about auras. Nobody is told about Kilner. Nobody is told about anything. A camera records the room in infrared, so that he has a record of where every person is and what they are doing in the dark. The dark adaptation takes half an hour. They sit in silence in a room with no light at all, and Rook, sitting with them, notices how quickly the mind starts to furnish an empty black space with suggestions, and reminds himself that this is exactly the point. This is exactly why the effect works, and feels reassured. Then, one at a time, each volunteer looks at a shielded light source through the dark screen for 30 seconds. Then each is guided to a chair facing an empty wall, and given the third screen, and asked to describe anything they see. The first volunteer, a woman in her 30s, sees the border. She describes it well. A thin line of light around Rook's hands when he holds them up. A soft haze past that. She's interested and a little delighted. It is exactly, precisely what Kilner described. And Rook writes down the word Mach and underlines it, and feels the pleasant weight of a hypothesis behaving itself. The second volunteer, a man in his 50s, sees nothing at all. Grain, darkness, a vague brightness where the door is. He's faintly disappointed and slightly bored, and Rook likes him enormously for it. The third volunteer is a postgraduate student named Priya. She takes the screen. She looks toward the wall. She does not say anything for a while, and Rook, watching her on the infrared feed, sees her posture change. She goes very still. Not frozen with fear, not yet. Just still in the way a person goes still when they are trying to work out whether they have misheard their own name. She turns her head slowly to the left, toward the corner of the room near the equipment cabinet, where there is a narrow space between the cabinet and the wall. Rook asks her what she can see. Priya says in a completely level voice that there is a person standing in the corner. Rook calmly tells her that there are 3 people in the room and that everyone is accounted for and that she can lower the screen at any time. Priya says she knows there are 3 people in the room. Then she says, still level, still calm, that the person in the corner is much too tall and that it does not have a face, and that she does not think it was there when she sat down. And then her voice changes, and this is the part of the recording that Rook will listen to more times than is good for him, because there is a moment where she stops sounding like someone describing a hallucination and starts sounding like someone reporting a fact about a room. She says, "It moved." Rook says nothing moved. The infrared feed shows nothing. He is watching it. Priya says, "It turned its head. It is looking at me now. It was looking at the wall, and now it is looking at me." Rook stands up to end the session, and Priya says, very quietly, almost apologetically, the sentence that ends Rook's career as it existed before that night. "That one knows we can see it." He takes the screen from her. He puts the lights on. The corner is empty. Priya is shaking and embarrassed and apologises several times, and Rook reassures her with all the correct language about the visual system and the dark and expectation, and he means every word of it, and he writes it all up. And then, at 11 at night, alone, with the room lights off and the door locked and the camera still running because he is nothing if not thorough, Dr. Julian Rook sits down in the chair Priya sat in. He dark adapts. He looks at the light through the dark screen for 30 seconds, and he raises the third screen and looks at the corner. The recording captures the next 4 minutes. In it, Rook does not speak. He does not move. At one point, near the end, he lowers the screen and sits in complete darkness for perhaps 40 seconds, and then raises it again, in exactly the same way that a British physician did beside a sickbed 100 and some years earlier, for exactly the same reason, hoping for exactly the same result. Then he puts the screen down on the floor and he leaves the room, and he does not turn the lights on when he goes, because he does not want to be able to see the corner clearly. In his notes that night he writes one line. It is standing where she said it was standing. What follows is 6 months of the most careful, most frightened research of Rook's life. He brings in Calder because he needs someone who will not humour him. They design the only test that actually matters, the one that separates a hallucination from an object. Independent, simultaneous observation. If two people looking through separate screens, in separate parts of a room, without speaking, without seeing each other's notes, describe a figure in the same location, with the same posture, at the same moment, then whatever they are seeing is not being generated inside their heads. Hallucinations are private. They are assembled by an individual brain out of that brain's own material, and two brains do not assemble the same one by accident. They run it 31 times. They use a grid marked on the floor. Each observer holds a card and marks a square. They are separated by a partition. They do not speak until the session ends. On 19 of the 31 runs, both observers report nothing. On 5, one reports a figure and the other does not, which is exactly what you would expect from noise. On 7, both mark the same square, not adjacent squares, the same square. And on 4 of those, both observers independently describe the same orientation of the head. Calder, who has spent 20 years being impossible to impress, sits on the floor of the laboratory after the 29th run with her back against a cabinet and does not get up for a while. And slowly, from the accumulated descriptions, a picture assembles itself, and it is not the picture either of them expected. They are tall, consistently tall, well beyond human height, though it is hard to be precise because they do not seem to stand at floor level in any reliable way. The limbs are long and the joints are wrong, or rather the joints are not where a joint would help. The head is tilted, always, and it has no features whatsoever, but the crucial detail, the one that Rook keeps returning to in his notes, is how they are visible. They are not luminous, they do not shine, they emit nothing. They are visible because everything else bends around them. The faint field that Kilner spent his career documenting, the haze around every living body, does not simply stop when it reaches one of these shapes. It deflects, it curves away and flows around, the way smoke curves around an obstacle in a wind tunnel, the way a river runs around a stone, which means the figures are not made of light. They are made of the absence of it. They are holes in the visual field, and you can only see a hole if there is something around it to show you the edges. And that, Rook writes, is why no one has ever photographed one. A camera records what arrives at its sensor. These things do not send anything. There is nothing to arrive. They are only visible to a system that is already building a model of a room and can notice when part of that model has been carved out. You cannot photograph them. You can only witness them. And then comes the second discovery, and it is worse. And Rook notices it in himself before he notices it in anyone else, which is the way these things always go. He is on a train. It is Tuesday evening, dim, the carriage half empty, the windows already gone black with early winter. He's not thinking about the research. He's thinking about nothing at all, in the pleasant blank way of a person on a train, watching the reflections of the interior lights slide along the glass, and he sees at the far end of the carriage, standing between the last row of seats and the door, something tall with its head tilted. He's not holding a screen. He does not have a screen with him. He looks away, and he counts to 10, and he looks back, and it is gone, and he tells himself that he is exhausted, and that his visual system has spent 6 months being trained to find a specific shape in low light, and is now finding it, obligingly, in a train carriage, the way a person learning a new word starts hearing it everywhere. That explanation holds for about 3 weeks. Then he sees one in a car park, then in a stairwell, then in his own kitchen at 6 in the morning, standing in the space between the refrigerator and the wall, and this time he does not look away, and this time it does not go. And Rook stands in his own kitchen holding a mug of tea for a very long time before he sets it down and goes to sit in his car. He works out what has happened, because that is what he is trained to do, and the answer is elegant and appalling. The screen was never a window. It was a lesson. The human visual system is not a camera. It is a prediction machine. It receives a messy, noisy, low-quality stream of data, and it constructs a stable model of the world out of it. And the way it does that is by learning what to keep and what to discard. Most of what falls on your retina in any given second is thrown away as irrelevant, and what counts as irrelevant is learned. The screen forces the brain, over and over, to attend to a signal it has always discarded, and to associate that signal with a coherent object, and to build a shape out of it. And the brain, being excellent at its job, learns. Once it has learned that a certain pattern of deflection in the visual field corresponds to a real object in the room, it does not need the screen anymore. The signal was always arriving. It was always coming in. The screen only ever amplified it enough to teach the classifier what to look for, and there is no mechanism for unlearning it. You do not forget how to read once you have learned. You cannot look at a word in your own language and see meaningless shapes again. The recognition happens before you have any say in the matter. Kilner's glass does not show you a hidden world. It teaches you to stop not seeing one. And once you have learned, you may be learning permanently. Rook goes back to the archives after that, and this time he is not researching. He is looking for a way out. He is looking for anything the old man might have left behind for someone in exactly his position. And in a private collection of Edwardian medical correspondence, in a letter never published, written in 1919, 1 year before Kilner's death, to a colleague whose name has been struck through by a later hand, he finds it. It is not long. Kilner is unwell by then, and his handwriting is poor. He writes that he is often asked why he did not pursue the stronger screens, and that he has told most people it was because the results were disappointing, and that this was a lie which he now regrets. He writes that he stopped because of what happened to the subjects. 3 of them, he says, suffered complete nervous collapse. 1 left his home in the night and was never found. 2 continued to report sightings for years afterward, with no screen in ordinary daylight, and one of those 2 he describes only as being beyond the reach of medicine. And then he writes the line that Rook copies out by hand and keeps in his wallet, and which is, in every version of this story that gets told, the sentence that people remember. We are visible to them naturally. They become visible to us only through interference. Read it again slowly because it takes a second to land. He is not saying that the glass introduced us to something new. He is saying it was never mutual. He is saying that for the whole of human history, we have been standing in the open, in full view, unable to see who was looking, and that the glass did not open a door. It only turned on a light in a room that had never been empty. Here is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about institutions, which is where every conspiracy earns its name. Because there is a perfectly good military reason to be interested in a piece of glass that lets a person see something invisible. In the years before the First World War, according to the story, someone in the British War Office read the human atmosphere and did not laugh. They did not care about auras or diagnosis, or the health of a patient's outer haze. They cared about one line, buried in the middle of the book, in which Kilner mentions that with the screens, in poor light, a human body stands out against a dark background more clearly than with the naked eye. That is a targeting technology. That is a sentry standing in a trench at 3 a.m, straining into a black field where a raiding party may or may not be crawling toward him. So the story says a small program was funded, quietly, under an unremarkable optics budget line, and it was given a name that meant nothing to anyone who saw it on paper. Project Veil. The early work is dull and plausible. Filter chemistry, concentration trials, frames that could be fitted to a periscope or held in a gloved hand in the wet. Observers trained through the dark adaptation procedure, which soldiers were already doing informally, because every night sentry in history has known that you do not look directly at what you are trying to see in the dark. And the reports that come back from the trials are at first exactly what was hoped for. Improved detection of moving figures at distance in low light, positive results, recommendations to expand. Then the other reports start. They come in slowly, and they come in from different sectors, from men who have not spoken to each other, and they are consistent in a way that no fabrication ever is. Observers report figures in no man's land that are too tall and do not crouch. Observers report shapes in the trenches themselves, standing in the traverses, in the narrow bends where men squeeze past one another sideways. And then the detail that turns Project Veil from an odd footnote into something that people still whisper about a century later. The observers report that the figures gather around the wounded, not around the dead, around the dying. They come to a man who is going to die in the next hour, and they stand near him, several of them sometimes, and they do not touch him, and they do not move, and when he is dead they disperse, and one observer writes, in a sentence that survived into the retellings, that they left the way people leave a table. The men in the program stop sleeping. That is the documented failure mode if the documents exist. Extreme insomnia, then paranoia, then a specific and unbearable terror of empty rooms, which is a much more frightening symptom than a fear of the dark, because a fear of the dark can be cured with a lamp. Several observers are removed from duty. At least one is institutionalized. The program is closed, and the screens are collected, and the story goes that the collection was unusually thorough, and that this is the real reason so few authentic Kilner screens survive. Not the dye shortage, the collection. And then, decades later, the story picks up again, in a different country and a different technology, night vision. American programs, working through the middle of this century, exploring every possible way to make a soldier see in the dark. Image intensification, infrared, and, in a handful of experimental branches, spectral filtering, narrow band systems, devices designed to look at very specific slices of light. And in some of those trials, according to the story, soldiers on night exercises begin reporting humanoid shapes moving among the trees. Not enemies, not each other. Tall figures with a wrongness to the gait, appearing in the device and not to the naked eye. The psychological casualties are severe enough that the specific branch is abandoned, and the abandonment is justified on ordinary technical grounds, because the systems were expensive and the results were poor, and nobody has to lie about a program that failed to perform. And here the conspiracy makes its cleverest move, the move that separates a good conspiracy from a bad one. Because a bad conspiracy hides things. Hiding is hard. Hiding requires effort forever. Documents leak, people talk, families find boxes in attics after a funeral. A good conspiracy does not hide anything. A good conspiracy makes the truth embarrassing. So the story goes that no one ever seriously tried to erase Discianin glass from history. Instead, over decades, quietly, with no drama at all, the subject was allowed to drift into the company of the ridiculous. Kilner screens appeared in mail-order catalogues beside pendulums and Ouija boards. Cheap violet plastic was sold as the genuine article to people who wanted to photograph their own energy. The word aura did the rest of the work all by itself, and now, if a serious researcher finds a genuine screen and observes something impossible and tries to tell a colleague, the colleague's face does a particular thing. You have seen that face. It is the face of a reasonable person deciding kindly not to ask a follow-up question. Ridicule is the cheapest containment ever invented. It costs nothing, it never expires, and the people enforcing it do not even know they are doing it. They think they are just being sensible, and that, the story says, is precisely why it works. Rook by this point is no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. He is trying to understand what they want. So he does what he did as a young clinician, which is to gather data patiently in the places where sick people are, and he begins observing hospitals. He has access. He is a consultant. Nobody questions a doctor walking slowly down a corridor at night with an odd expression on his face, because that describes most doctors at night. And a pattern emerges, and it is not random, and that is the part he cannot make peace with. They are not evenly distributed. They are not standing in the car parks or the cafeterias or the staff rooms. He notes their positions for weeks, and they cluster in exactly the places you would expect if you were writing a horror story, which is why he distrusts his own observation for a long time. Intensive care, operating theatres, but only during certain procedures, hospices, heavily, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single room, and, with a frequency that surprises him, ordinary wards at night around patients who are not dying at all but who are frightened. Delirious patients, post-surgical confusion, dementia patients in the small hours, in that state nurses know well, when a person who was calm at dinner becomes convinced at 2 a.m. that there are people in the room. That last one takes him a while to accept, and when he does, something rearranges itself in his chest. Because those patients are not confused about the room. They are the only people in the building who have not learned to disbelieve their own eyes. At first, Rook assumes the obvious. They are drawn to death. They gather where life is ending, the way anything might. Scavengers, witnesses, mourners even. There is a version of this that is almost gentle, and he holds on to it for a while because it lets him imagine that he has discovered something sad rather than something predatory. Then he does the statistics. He is careful about it. He controls for severity, for age, for diagnosis, for the simple and enormous fact that sicker patients are in the rooms where he sees more of them. It takes him months and it ruins his health. And what he finds, in the small data set he's able to build, is that among patients of equivalent severity, the ones with figures standing near them do worse, not dramatically, not immediately, but they deteriorate faster. They decline in a way that the numbers do not otherwise explain, which reverses the entire picture, the way a single word can reverse a sentence. He had assumed the figures gathered because a person was dying. The data suggests the person is dying faster because the figures have gathered. They may not be witnesses at all. And Rook writes, in the notes that Calder finds later, that he has stopped being able to think of the hospice rooms as rooms where people are being watched over. He thinks of them now as rooms where something is eating slowly and politely, and taking its time, and does not need to hurry, because nobody at the table can see it. Calder finds the other half of it, and she finds it almost by accident, and it is the piece that turns the story from a horror story into something closer to a tragedy. She has children. That is all it is. She has a 2-year-old, and one night the child stands up in the cot and looks at the corner of the nursery near the wardrobe and laughs. And Calder, who is a scientist and who has spent a year analysing a piece of glass, does not sleep afterward. and starts reading developmental literature. And the literature is entirely ordinary. Infants attend to empty space constantly. They track things adults do not track. Their visual systems are wildly over-inclusive, taking in far more than they will as adults, and then, through the first years of life, they prune, aggressively. The brain removes connections it does not use and narrows its attention to the categories the world has confirmed are worth having. Imaginary friends appear around 2 or 3 and disappear around 6 or 7 with a reliability that is almost suspicious. The standard explanation is that children grow out of it. Rook's explanation is different, and once you've heard it, you cannot unhear it. He proposes that we do not evolve toward better perception. We evolve toward useful perception. And a creature that can see something, it cannot fight, cannot flee, cannot affect, and cannot avoid, gains nothing from seeing it. It gains only terror. Terror is metabolically expensive. Terror interferes with hunting and sleeping and raising young. So the pruning is not a limitation. It is a filter, and the filter was selected for. And it was selected for because our ancestors who could see them were less successful at staying alive than the ones who could not. We are not blind by accident. We were made blind on purpose, by the slow, indifferent machinery of survival, because seeing was worse. Our blindness is protection. And Kilner, in a small dark room in London, with a piece of coloured glass and the best intentions in the world, found the switch and turned it off. If that is true, then somebody eventually had to notice, and this is where the story reaches its final and largest claim, the one that gives it its name. Rook, following paper trails through declassified optics research and procurement records, and the strange bland language of post-war scientific cooperation, becomes convinced that at some point in the years after the Second World War, a small number of governments arrived at the same conclusion independently, and then did something almost unheard of. They agreed, not publicly. There is no treaty with this name in any archive you can search. But according to the story, there is an understanding, informal and durable and inherited across generations of administrators who mostly do not know what they are administering, and it is referred to, in the few places it is referred to at all, as the Violet Accord. Its purpose is not to hide the existence of the entities. That would require explaining them, and nobody can. Its purpose is much narrower and much stranger, and it comes down to 5 simple objectives, which Rook writes out in a list on a single sheet of paper, to ensure that authentic formulations of the Kilner solution are not published or reproduced, to acquire and hold original screens wherever they surface, to monitor private and academic work that approaches the relevant spectral band, and most importantly, and most specifically, to prevent any attempt at high-intensity projection through the filters, and finally, underneath, the objective that all the others serve, to prevent mass visual adaptation. Sit with that last one because it is the whole thing. The danger, in this version of events, was never a haunted piece of glass in a laboratory. One researcher who learns to see is a tragedy for one researcher. Even 100 is manageable. They can be discredited, medicated, retired, quietly pensioned into silence. The danger is scale. Because if the effect is learned, and it is learned by exposure, then in principle it can be taught to anyone. And we now live in a world where every human being carries a screen that emits light directly into their eyes for several hours every day, in dim rooms, often in the dark, often when tired. The Accord's nightmare, Rook writes, is a single evening, one broadcast, one correctly calibrated display in that narrow band at sufficient intensity, going out simultaneously to a few 100 million people who are lying in bed with the lights off. Not a haunting, an education. Governments were never protecting the public from the knowledge that ghosts exist. Knowledge is survivable. People believe extraordinary things and go to work the next morning. They were protecting the public from a perceptual breach. From the moment when several 100 million people simultaneously acquire the ability to see what is standing in their bedrooms, and cannot unlearn it and never sleep properly again. There is no policy response to that. There is no army you can send. Every hospital, every workplace, every road at night. A civilization cannot function if everyone in it can see. And there is one more thing in Kilner's final material, and it is the reason the Accord's fourth objective is written the way it is. The reason projection specifically is forbidden. Because Kilner concluded before he stopped that the window works in both directions. He noticed it in the pattern of the sightings. The observers who used the screens most often were not simply seeing more figures, they were being approached. The figures came nearer, they oriented sooner, they appeared in the observer's home rather than in the clinic. They began to be waiting in rooms the observer had not yet entered, and Kilner's conclusion, written in his last notebook, is the most unsettling sentence in the entire story, because it is so calm. He wrote that the glass is not a filter, but an interface, and that every experiment teaches both parties how to recognise one another. We learn to see them, they learn where to find us, and a strong enough screen, projecting rather than merely receiving, would not be a window at all. It would be an introduction. There is one more location in this story, and then we're nearly done, and you're welcome to let most of this dissolve as we go. It is somewhere in the north. The story is deliberately vague about where, in the way these stories always are, and Rook's notes give only a grid reference and the phrase former Air Ministry site. A decommissioned research station, Cold War era, fenced, posted, and empty for decades. The kind of place that appears on maps as a blank rectangle with no label, where the buildings are low and flat-roofed and the grass has grown through the concrete of the apron. Rook and Calder go there in November. They are not brave. That is worth saying. They are two exhausted scientists who can no longer function in ordinary life, who see figures in stairwells and car parks and their own kitchens, and who have been told by the paper trail that the last high-intensity Kilner apparatus ever built is still inside. They go because they want it to stop. The perimeter fence is old and the gate is not seriously locked. What is strange, and what they both note independently, is the electricity. The site has power, not lights, nothing so obvious. But there is a hum from a low outbuilding, and the meter housing is new, and there are cables running from it to the main block, and when Calder touches the conduit it is faintly warm. A facility that was abandoned decades ago, with no staff, no purpose, and no signage beyond the usual official warnings, is drawing a continuous and substantial load. Inside, the corridors are what you would expect. Peeling paint, standing water, doors hanging off, a smell of wet plaster and rust. But at the end of the main corridor there is a door that is not what you would expect. Steel. Sealed. Newer than the building around it, with a gasket and a wheel handle like a ship's bulkhead, and beside it a panel of indicator lights, and on that panel 3 of the lights are lit. Behind the door is the observation chamber. It is a room. Within a room, walls lined with copper mesh, and at its centre is a frame holding a single enormous pane of dark glass, taller than a person, and behind it the housing of a light source built to push an extraordinary amount of energy through it. Not a screen you hold, a screen you illuminate a room with. And in a cabinet in the outer chamber, in cardboard folders soft with age, are the reports from the final trial. They read them by torchlight standing up, because neither of them wants to sit down. The trial involved 11 personnel, 6 inside the chamber, 5 in the outer room at the instruments. 22 minutes into the run, the record becomes disordered. There are gaps in the log. There is a note about the internal temperature falling in a way the equipment could not account for. Of the 6 inside the chamber, 4 were never found. 1 was found, and the report describes the condition in language that the writer clearly struggled with, and the summary is that a man of 34 years of age was recovered from the chamber, with the physiology of a man in his 80s, and that this occurred within the 22 minutes of the run, and that no explanation is offered because no explanation was available. And one survived intact, physically, and was interviewed at length, and said very little that was useful. He answered most questions with silence. He would not be alone. He would not be in any room with a corner he could not see. And when asked directly what had happened when the projector was brought to full power, he said one sentence, and the interviewer recorded it verbatim, and it is the sentence that everyone who tells this story remembers. They have always owned the rooms between our rooms. After the trial, the site was closed, but it was not shut down, and that is the detail that makes Rook's hands shake as he reads it, because there is a maintenance schedule in the folder, and it runs to the present decade. The chamber systems were never switched off. Whatever the run opened, the facility has been sitting on top of it for 60 years, quietly, on a maintenance contract, drawing power from the national grid like a fridge nobody remembers plugging in. And on the panel by the door, while they stand there reading, one of the 3 lit indicators changes colour. Calder notices it first. She says his name. And somewhere below them, in the plant room, the hum they have been hearing since they arrived, the hum that has been running continuously since before either of them was born, stutters. The failure does not look like a disaster. That is the thing about infrastructure. It never does. Over the following weeks, in the towns within perhaps 40 miles of the site, the reports begin, and they arrive scattered across the internet in the places where such things always arrive, in local groups and forums and comment threads, unconnected, unremarkable, easy to explain one at a time. A woman posts that her hallway looks longer at night than it does during the day, and asks whether anyone else's does. A man posts a photograph of his garden taken with a cheap camera modified for infrared, and asks what the vertical smear near the shed is, and 40 people tell him it is a lens artifact, and he agrees with them, and he does not sleep in that house again. A nurse writes, and then deletes, a post about how many patients on her ward have started asking who the tall man is. Children stop wanting the hall light off. Nobody dies. Nothing burns down. There is no moment of panic on any news broadcast anywhere. There is only a slow, quiet, regional increase in the number of people who are frightened of their own homes at 3 in the morning and who have no story to tell about why. And Rook, reading all of it from a rented room, understands what is actually happening, and it is not what anyone would assume. Nothing is coming through. That is the misunderstanding at the heart of every version of this legend, and he corrects it in his notes with what looks almost like exasperation. There is no breach in the sense of a door opening. There is no invasion. Nothing is crossing from somewhere else into here, because there is no somewhere else. There never was. The chamber, running at full power for 6 decades, has been doing to its surroundings, very slowly and very weakly, what the screen did to Priya in 20 minutes. Teaching. The people in those towns are not being visited. They are, simply, gradually, at the rate of a few more of them every week, learning how to see the world they have always lived in. And that is the true horror of the whole thing, if there is one, and it is not the tall figures and it is not the wrongness of their limbs. It is that nothing about the world would need to change at all. Everything you are afraid of tonight is already exactly where it is. Every room you have ever been alone in was arranged exactly the way it is arranged now. The only thing that has ever stood between you and that fact is a small piece of neurological housekeeping, performed on your visual cortex before you were old enough to remember it. You're not protected by an empty room. You're protected by the part of you that insists on calling it empty. Rook goes back into the chamber, alone, because Calder will not go, and because someone has to, and because the last page of Kilner's private notebook contains something Rook has been carrying for months without telling her. A method for closing it. It is a sequence. Coloured light in a precise order, at specific durations, delivered through the screens in reverse. Kilner worked it out in his final year, and used it on himself, and recorded the outcome in a single line, and the line is not encouraging and it is not discouraging either. It says only that the effect was complete, because the sequence does not repair the eye. There is nothing wrong with the eye. It retrains the filter. It rebuilds the suppression, forcibly, by flooding the system with contradiction until the classifier gives up, and returns to discarding what it was always designed to discard, and it takes everything associated with it. Everything learned during the period of seeing goes with the seeing, not just the figures, the rooms they stood in, the people who were there, the work, the reasoning, the years. You do not get to close the window and remember what you saw through it. The memory is the same machinery as the sight. Rook stands in the chamber with the sequence programmed and his hand near the control, and he waits, because he wants to look at it once more properly, without a handheld screen, without an experiment, without a hypothesis. He wants to know what he actually lives in. And when the projector comes up to power, he sees it. The room does not fill with figures. The room does not change at all. It simply becomes visible, and it is not a room. The chamber is one small compartment inside a structure that continues in directions the building does not go. There are surfaces overlapping the walls. There are levels above and below that are not floors. Corridors run through the concrete without regard for it, wide and busy, and they were there when the concrete was poured, and they will be there after it falls down. And there are cities. That is the word he uses afterward, before he forgets, and it is a poor word, and he knows it. Structures within structures, occupying the same space as the hills outside, the same space as the towns, the same space as every house in every one of those towns, layered through them the way a chord is layered through a single note. And there are so many of them, standing in the streets that run through our streets, standing in kitchens, standing beside beds in rooms where people are asleep and have always been asleep and have never once been alone, not hunting, not hiding, just going about whatever the equivalent of a life is, in a world that was never hidden from us, because hiding would have required effort and none was ever necessary. For one moment, Dr. Julian Rook sees the actual shape of the place where his species lives, and then the sequence begins, and the light comes, blue and then green, and then a violet so deep it is barely there at all, and the chamber fills with it, and the structures thin, and the figures fade, and the corridors close like something drawing breath, and everything disappears. Months later, in a city in the south, an ophthalmologist named Julian Rook sees patients on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He knows that he had an accident. He was examining an antique optical filter, some Edwardian thing, and there was an incident with a light source, and he was unwell for a while afterward and lost a stretch of time. He finds it mildly embarrassing. His colleagues are kind about it in the way colleagues are kind about a thing they have decided not to ask about. He does not remember a facility in the north. He does not remember a chemist named Nessa Calder, and if you showed him her photograph he would look at it politely and hand it back, and this would not distress him at all, which is somehow the saddest part. She is listed as a missing person. The case is not active. The wooden case with the brass corners is gone. The screens are gone. The site in the north was demolished at some point during the period Rook cannot account for, and the land was sold, and there is a solar installation on it now, which is a very modern kind of ending. Rook sleeps well. He has no unusual fears. He does not mind empty rooms, and he has never understood why anyone would. And then, on an ordinary afternoon in autumn, with the light going amber outside and the last appointment of the day running late, a mother brings in her daughter, who is 6 years old. The problem, the mother explains, is that the girl says she sees people, not all the time, in the evening mostly, in her bedroom and in the hallway and once in the back of the car. She says they are tall and that they do not talk. She has stopped sleeping properly, and the mother is exhausted and slightly ashamed to be here, and asks whether it could be her eyes. Rook examines her thoroughly, because he's a good doctor, and finds nothing at all. And then he crouches down to the girl's level, in the way he has crouched down to 1,000 children, and he explains it gently. He tells her that the edges of our vision are not very good at details, and that they are much better at movement than at shapes, and that when the light is low the brain has to guess, and that sometimes the brain guesses person because person is the most important thing it could possibly be. and so it guesses that first. He tells her it is not her eyes. He tells her it is not her being silly. He tells her it happens to almost everyone, and that it will fade as she gets older. And every word of that is true, and he believes it completely, and it is the best answer that medicine has. The girl listens. She nods, and then she looks past him, at the door of the office, which is behind him and slightly to his left, and her face changes, not into a scream. 6-year-olds who scream are 6-year-olds who are still in charge of the situation. Her face simply empties, the colour going out of it from the top down, and her small hands go flat against her legs, and she whispers, "It followed you." Rook turns. The office is empty. The door is closed. There is a coat stand beside it with his coat on it, and the light from the window is lying in a long amber bar across the floor. There is nothing there. But for a fraction of a second, less than a blink, in the narrow strip of shadow between the doorframe and the wall, something in Rook's visual cortex does what it was trained to do and produces a shape. Tall, head tilted, and gone. He straightens up. He turns back to the girl and he smiles, and he tells her mother that everything is completely normal and that these things pass. And that night he lies in bed in the dark, in a room he has slept in for months without a single thought, and finds that he does not want to look at the corner by the wardrobe. He does not know why. Some part of his brain still remembers how to look, and has been quietly waiting for permission. And here is the ending underneath the ending, the one this whole story has been walking toward. Walter John Kilner did not give up because he was mocked. Mockery is survivable, and he had already survived it once, and he was stubborn enough to survive it again. According to the conspiracy, he stopped because he understood what he had actually found, which was not a new organ of perception, or a diagnostic tool, or a proof of the soul. He had found the reason we are built the way we are. He had found that our species did not evolve towards seeing more. It evolved deliberately and at cost towards seeing less, because the ones who saw everything did not do well, and did not raise children, and did not become us. Human blindness is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. It is camouflage. And it works, and it has worked for a very long time, and it only fails when someone very clever and very curious and very well-intentioned decides to improve on it. So if you are lying in the dark right now, and there is a corner of the room you can almost see, and something in you is deciding whether or not to look at it, do not bother. Not because there is nothing there, but because the part of you that keeps telling you the room is empty has been doing that job faithfully, without a single day off, since before you could speak, and it has never once asked you for anything, and it is the reason you are able to sleep at all. Let it work. That is what it is for. Kilner believed his violet glass revealed the atmosphere surrounding the human body. According to the conspiracy, what it actually revealed was the reason human beings were never meant to stare into empty space for too long. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment and tell me your town, your city, your country, whatever you are comfortable sharing. It is one of my favourite things about this channel, seeing how far this little sleepy corner of the internet reaches while most of the world is awake. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of America's most persistent mysteries, I want to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into history's shadows. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It keeps these stories coming. And a huge thank you to Michael for suggesting tonight's topic. This one goes deep. Now let's talk about a secret society that might have changed America forever. Picture this. It's late April in the year 1865. Richmond, Virginia, lies in ruins. Smoke still rises from buildings set ablaze during the evacuation. The Confederate capital has fallen, and Jefferson Davis, president of the dying Confederacy, is fleeing south with whatever remains of his government. In the chaos of that retreat, a train of wagons moves through the darkness, creaking under the weight of heavy cargo. The guards riding alongside are exhausted, but they stay alert. They know what they're protecting. Gold bars wrapped in canvas, silver coins in wooden chests, banknotes and bonds representing fortunes, the final treasury of the Confederate States of America, everything that remains of a nation that's bleeding to death. History tells us most of that gold was captured, stolen or lost during the desperate retreat. The official records are clear. The case is closed. The Confederate treasury was seized or scattered, and that's the end of it. But what if I told you that eyewitness accounts from that period tell a very different story? What if Union officers testified, under oath, that massive quantities of gold were never recovered? What if there was no clear chain of custody for millions of dollars worth of Confederate assets? What if the math simply doesn't add up, and nobody wants to talk about why? And what if the same name kept appearing in post-war rumours, whispered in backrooms and coded letters? A name that most history textbooks barely mention, if they mention it at all. A name that makes historians uncomfortable when you bring it up at academic conferences. The Knights of the Golden Circle. Tonight, we're going to explore one of America's most enduring conspiracy theories. A secret society that may have planned the Civil War, financed terrorism, and hidden a fortune that could still be buried somewhere in the American South. This isn't fiction. Every event I'm about to describe is documented. The only question is how the pieces fit together. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the secret society the Civil War never buried. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Empire. The year is 1854. Most Americans have never heard of Kansas, Nebraska. The Republican Party is brand new, formed just months earlier by anti-slavery activists who are horrified by the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And in Cincinnati, Ohio, a man named George Washington Lafayette Bickley is about to change history in ways that are still being felt today. Bickley was a curious figure, and that's putting it mildly. Officially he was a physician, though his medical credentials were questionable at best. He claimed to have studied in Britain, but no records support this. He styled himself as a professor and academic, but universities had no record of employing him. What he really was, in modern terms, was a con artist, a propagandist, and what we might today call a political operative with dangerous ideas. But he had charisma. People who met him described a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a voice that could fill a room. He could talk for hours without notes, weaving elaborate visions of southern glory and manifest destiny. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't just want to belong to something. They want to belong to something secret, something special, something that makes them feel chosen. In that year, Bickley founded a secret society. He called it the Knights of the Golden Circle. The name wasn't poetic or symbolic. It was literal, and it was terrifying if you understood what it meant. Bickley envisioned a slave-holding empire that would stretch in a massive circle, 2,400 miles in radius, centered on Havana, Cuba. This golden circle would encompass the entire American South, all of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. It would be, in Bickley's feverish vision, a paradise built on slave labour and southern aristocracy. An empire where wealthy white landowners would rule over millions of enslaved people, extracting unlimited wealth from sugar, cotton, and coffee plantations stretching from Virginia to Venezuela. The plan was detailed, disturbingly detailed. Bickley didn't just have a vision, he had maps, he had economic projections, he had military strategies for conquering Mexico and Central America. He had calculated how many enslaved workers would be needed, how much profit could be generated, how the empire would be governed. It sounds insane. It was insane. But here's the thing that should genuinely disturb you. People listened. Important people, wealthy people, powerful people. The Knights of the Golden Circle wasn't some fringe group meeting in basements and wearing silly hats. It was organised like a military operation from day one. The structure was hierarchical and sophisticated. At the top were the castle leaders, men of wealth and influence who recruited members and organised local chapters. Below them were degrees of initiation, each requiring oaths, rituals, and the learning of secret codes and hand signals. Members didn't just join, they were initiated. The ceremonies involved darkness, candles, dramatic oaths sworn on weapons and symbols. New members were told they were joining something ancient and powerful, though in reality the organisation was barely older than they were. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of being part of a brotherhood, a conspiracy, a movement that was going to reshape the world. The knights learned coded language that allowed them to identify each other and communicate in plain sight. They used hand signs borrowed from Masonic traditions. They organised into local chapters called castles, each with its own treasury, meeting place, and roster of members, and they recruited aggressively, targeting men with influence, money, and military experience. By the year 1860, just 6 years after the organisation's founding, conservative estimates suggest the Knights had over 40,000 members across the South and border states. Some historians think the number was much higher, possibly as many as 60 or 70,000. They had infiltrated southern military units, state legislatures, railroad companies and banks. They had money, influence, and most importantly a plan. The KGC wasn't just talking about secession, they were preparing for it. They were stockpiling weapons, they were identifying targets, they were creating networks that could move information, money and people across state lines without detection. They were building an infrastructure for war before the war had even started. And here's what should really make you think. When the Civil War finally came, when the South seceded and the shooting started, Confederate leaders seemed remarkably prepared. Communication networks were already in place, supply lines had been thought through, sympathisers in northern states were already organised and ready to cause problems. How much of that preparedness came from the Knights of the Golden Circle? We'll never know for sure, but the timing is awfully convenient. Chapter 2. The Shadow War. When the Civil War finally erupted in April of 1861 with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter, something strange happened to the Knights of the Golden Circle. Officially, publicly, the organisation dissolved. Newspapers that had occasionally mentioned the group suddenly stopped. Meeting halls went quiet. The Knights of the Golden Circle seemed to have vanished into history just as the conflict they had helped create was beginning. But Union intelligence reports tell a very different story. And these weren't conspiracy theories or rumours. These were official military intelligence documents, filed by commanders who were genuinely worried about what they were seeing. The Knights didn't disappear. They simply went underground and changed their names, the way a criminal might use an alias when the law gets too close. Some became the Order of American Knights. Others called themselves the Sons of Liberty, deliberately invoking Revolutionary War imagery to make their treason seem patriotic. Same members, same oaths, same goals, just different letterhead. And throughout the war, accusations followed them like a shadow that wouldn't be shaken off. Union authorities documented case after case of sabotage, particularly in the border states of Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. These weren't Confederate states, these were Union territory. But they were full of Southern sympathisers, And more importantly, they were full of nights. Railroad tracks would be destroyed the night before major troop movements. How did the saboteurs know when trains would be passing? Telegraph lines would be cut at exactly the moments when Union commanders needed to communicate most urgently. Coincidence or inside information? Weapons shipments that should have reached Union armies mysteriously disappeared in transit. Where did those weapons go? Were they sold? Hidden? Sent south to Confederate forces? Draft resistance seemed too organised to be spontaneous. When the Union implemented conscription in 1863, riots erupted in multiple northern cities at almost the same time. That takes coordination. That takes planning. That takes an existing network of people willing to act together. Union commanders, particularly in the Western Theatre, became convinced they were fighting two wars simultaneously. One war against the Confederate Army in the South, which was difficult enough, and another war against a secret network operating in their own backyard, behind their own lines, sabotaging their efforts from within. The most dramatic case came in the summer of 1864 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Union authorities had been investigating suspected KGC activity for months. They were building a case, gathering evidence, identifying members, and in August they finally had enough to act. They arrested Harrison H. Dodd, identified as a high-ranking leader in what was now calling itself the Order of the American Knights. Dodd was a lawyer, a respected member of the community. He had money and connections. But Union investigators had evidence, they claimed, that he was planning something much bigger than simple draft resistance. The charges were staggering. Dodd was accused of planning to break Confederate prisoners out of northern prison camps and arm them for attacks on Union cities. The plan allegedly involved coordinating simultaneous uprisings in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, timed to coincide with Confederate military operations in the South. The goal was nothing less than forcing the Union to fight a two-front war, to divide their forces and potentially tip the balance toward Confederate victory. If even half of these charges were true, it was one of the most ambitious plots of the entire war. Dodd was placed under heavy guard in Indianapolis, awaiting a military tribunal that would almost certainly result in his execution for treason. And then he escaped, just walked out, disappeared, vanished like smoke. The official explanation was embarrassingly vague. Guards were supposedly bribed or distracted. Dodd had help from someone, obviously, but who, and where did he go afterward? Harrison H. Dodd was never found again. He didn't turn up dead. He wasn't captured later in the war. He simply ceased to exist in the historical record. A high-profile prisoner, accused of plotting massive domestic terrorism, just disappeared. How does that happen? How does a man awaiting trial for treason against the United States simply vanish in the middle of the largest war in American history? Who helped him? Where did he go? Did he flee to Confederate territory? Did he hide in plain sight under a new identity? Did he continue his activities from the shadows? The official records don't say. They can't say, because nobody knows. Or if anyone knew, they never told. But investigators at the time began to suspect something that would have been almost too frightening to admit publicly. The Knights of the Golden Circle, or whatever they were calling themselves now, hadn't been planning just for war. They had been planning for defeat. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a struggle that wouldn't end with military victory or defeat, but would continue for years, maybe decades afterward. They were preparing for the long game, and that meant they needed to survive as an organisation regardless of who won the war. Chapter 3. The Gold That Vanished. Let's go back to that night in April of 1865. Richmond, Virginia has fallen to Union forces. The Confederate capital, the beating heart of the rebellion, is now behind enemy lines. Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. The war is over, at least for all practical purposes. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, is fleeing south with what remains of his cabinet. They're moving fast, trying desperately to reach Texas or Mexico before Union cavalry catches them. It's a sad end for a government that once controlled 11 states and fielded massive armies. Now it's reduced to a handful of officials and guards. riding through the night, hoping to outrun history. With them travels the Confederate treasury, or what's left of it. Wagons loaded with boxes and barrels, guards posted at all times, everything that remains of a nation's wealth, being hauled down muddy roads in the darkness. On May 10th, 1865, Union troops finally catch up with Davis near Irwinville, Georgia. The capture itself is almost anticlimactic. Davis, exhausted and despairing, is taken without a fight. Union officers search the camp and seize the assets they find. Some gold coins, some silver. Personal effects belonging to Davis and his family. They load it all up, document what they've captured, and send Davis north to imprisonment. Case closed. War over. The Confederate treasury has been recovered, except it hasn't. Not really. Because here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply suspicious. The amount of gold and silver seized at Irwinville didn't match Confederate financial records. Not even close. Not within several $1 million of close. Confederate ledgers indicated the government had received substantial foreign loans, particularly from British and French sympathisers who believed in the Southern cause and saw profit in supporting it. They had held massive payroll funds to pay Confederate soldiers and officers. They had controlled private assets from Southern banks and wealthy donors who had literally given their fortunes to the cause. Ships had run the Union blockade carrying gold. Bonds had been sold. Wealth had been concentrated. Where did it all go? Union authorities interrogated Davis and his associates extensively. They weren't gentle about it. They wanted answers. They needed answers. The American people were demanding answers. Where was the Confederate gold? The responses they got were vague, contradictory, or simply non-existent. Some prisoners claimed the money had been spent during the long retreat from Richmond to Georgia. Spent on what? Food? Supplies? With what they had to show for it. Others said it had been stolen by deserting soldiers in the chaos of the Confederate collapse. Possible, but that would mean finding huge amounts of gold on random deserters, and that didn't happen. A few witnesses gave a different explanation, and this one kept coming up in different interviews, from different people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. They said the money had been distributed to various trusted officers with orders to hide it until the South could rise again. Hide it geographically, spread it out, make it impossible to find or seize all at once. That last explanation kept coming up. Hide it until the South could rise again, not spend it, not secure it, hide it. As if defeat was not the end of the conflict but merely an intermission. Witnesses later came forward with stories that gave texture to these vague explanations. A wagon train guarded by men in Confederate uniforms, splitting off from the main column near the Georgia-South Carolina border and heading into the wilderness. Where were they going? Nobody followed to find out. Gold bars being loaded onto mules in the dead of night while the main camp slept. Who ordered it? Who received it? Trusted officers receiving sealed orders from Davis himself and then disappearing into the countryside, never to rejoin the retreating government. And when investigators tried to track down these officers, tried to follow these leads, they hit walls. The men involved? Many were later identified as former Knights of the Golden Circle members, not suspected members, documented members whose names appeared on captured KGC membership rolls from earlier in the war. Southern bankers with secret affiliations who had managed the Confederacy's finances, Confederate intelligence officers who had spent the war running covert operations. These weren't random choices. These were men selected for a reason. Men who could keep secrets. Men who belonged to organizations that valued loyalty unto death. By 1866, barely a year after the war's end, rumours were spreading across the South like a fever. The gold was out there somewhere, buried in caches scattered across multiple states, hidden in caves known only to a few, divided among trusted guardians who had sworn oaths to protect it with their lives, and all of it allegedly marked with symbols, protected by coded maps, and defended by men who would kill to keep the secret. The treasure hunt had begun, and it would claim lives for decades to come. Chapter 4. Symbols in the Woods. Over the next several decades, something strange started happening across the American South. People began finding things in the woods, in their fields, carved into rocks on their property. Strange symbols, deliberate markings, messages from the past written in a language most people couldn't read. The symbols were consistent enough that researchers eventually compiled catalogues trying to decode them. Hearts with arrows pointing in specific directions, turtles with marks on their shells indicating numbers or distances, owls with one eye open, turkey tracks arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural, snakes forming circles or figure eights, all arranged in ways that suggested purpose, meaning, direction. These weren't random scratches made by bored travellers. These were carved with tools, positioned in relation to landmarks, often protected from weather by overhangs or deliberate placement. Someone had spent time on them. Someone had meant them to last. Someone had intended them to be found by people who would know what they meant. Were these markers pointing to buried Confederate gold? Or were they elaborate hoaxes created by con artists preying on Southern desperation and nostalgia? The problem with dismissing them as hoaxes is simple and disturbing. People who found these markers often died. Not eventually, not of old age, suspiciously, quickly, under circumstances that didn't quite add up. I'm not exaggerating for effect. There's a pattern in the historical record that's genuinely disturbing when you see it laid out. A farmer in rural Georgia finds a carved stone on his property while ploughing. It's got symbols he doesn't recognise, but they're clearly man-made and look old. He mentions it at church the following Sunday, excited about the possibility of finding treasure. 2 weeks later, he's found dead in the woods, supposedly from a hunting accident. Except he wasn't carrying a rifle. His rifle was found at home, so who shot him? A prospector in Arkansas discovers a map hidden in the lining of an old Confederate uniform he bought from a widow. The map shows landmarks he recognises, symbols he doesn't. He starts asking around town about the symbols, showing the map to people he trusts. His cabin burns down 3 weeks later with him inside. The fire inspector rules it an accident, despite finding evidence the door had been nailed shut from the outside. A family in Missouri begins digging in a suspicious location on their land after the grandfather claims he remembers Confederate soldiers burying something there during the war. They find a stone marker with KGC symbols. They dig deeper. Armed men arrive at their property one night, masked and carrying weapons. They order the family to stop digging, to forget what they've seen, and to never speak of it again. The family stops digging. They don't report it to the sheriff. When asked about it years later, they claim they don't remember what the armed men looked like or how many there were. They're terrified, decades after the fact. The newspapers of the late 1800s are full of these stories, particularly in Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky and Georgia. Local papers would run articles about mysterious deaths, strange intimidation, and treasure hunting gone wrong. And here's the unsettling part. In most cases, local sheriffs didn't investigate thoroughly. Or if they did, the cases were quietly dropped without explanation. Why? What pressure was being applied? Who had enough influence in multiple states to make law enforcement back off repeatedly? The implication is obvious but terrifying. Someone was guarding something, and they had enough power, enough reach, enough organisational capability to intimidate local law enforcement in multiple states across multiple decades. That's not a random group of treasure hoarders. That's an organisation, a network, a conspiracy that functioned across state lines and across generations. In the 1890s, newspapers in Texas and Arkansas ran multiple stories about mysterious armed men forcing landowners to abandon property. These weren't robberies. The armed men didn't steal anything. They didn't want the land, they just wanted the residents gone, immediately and permanently. No explanations, no negotiations. Just leave and don't come back. Some families complied. They packed up and left, abandoning property they'd owned for decades. Others tried to stand their ground and found themselves facing escalating harassment. Livestock killed, barns burned, warning shots fired at night. Eventually everyone left. Who were these men? What were they protecting? Were they remnants of the Knights of the Golden Circle, still operating decades after the Civil War? Were they descendants of the original knights, carrying on some kind of guardian tradition passed down through families? Were they hired muscle being paid by someone with resources and a vested interest in keeping certain areas undisturbed? Or were they something else entirely? Something that had evolved from the knights but wasn't quite the same? Organisation anymore? Chapter 5. From Knights to Clan. We need to talk about timing. And when I say we need to talk about it, I mean this is one of those historical coincidences that's almost too convenient to be a coincidence. December of 1865, Pulaski, Tennessee, just 8 months after the war's end. 6 Confederate veterans are sitting around, bored and restless. The war is over. They lost. The world they knew is gone. The social order they fought to preserve is being dismantled by Reconstruction. They're young men with military training and no purpose, so they form a social club. At least that's what they claim it is. They're bored, they say. They want something to do. They create elaborate costumes, mysterious rituals, grandiose titles that sound impressive but mean nothing. They ride through town at night in sheets and hoods, pretending to be ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. It's all just pranks and theatre, they insist. They call themselves the Ku Klux Klan. The name comes from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. Interesting choice of words, isn't it? Circle. At first, it really did seem to be just a social club. Costumes and midnight rides. Pranks designed to startle freedmen and carpetbaggers. It was juvenile, offensive, but not yet organised violence. But within 2 years, something changed. The play acting stopped being play. The social club transformed into something much darker, much more dangerous. A terrorist organisation dedicated to violently resisting Reconstruction and maintaining white supremacy through intimidation, assault, and murder. The transformation was remarkably quick and remarkably organised. Local chapters appeared across the South almost simultaneously. They had uniform rituals, similar costumes, and coordinated tactics. They operated with military precision. When they decided to target someone, the attacks would happen on the same night in multiple counties, making it impossible for limited law enforcement to respond effectively. This wasn't organic growth. This was activation of an existing network. The early Klan had a structure that looked awfully, disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied Confederate secret societies. Secret oaths sworn in darkness, coded language that allowed members to identify each other, local chapters operating independently but following central guidance, a hierarchical command system with elaborate titles, blood initiation ceremonies, penalties for breaking oaths that were clearly stated and genuinely frightening. Sound like anyone we've been talking about? Here's where conspiracy theorists get very interested, and honestly, their interest isn't entirely unjustified. Several early Klan leaders had documented ties to Confederate intelligence networks during the war. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Klan's first Grand Wizard, had commanded cavalry units that included known KGC members. He had experience with covert operations, raids behind enemy, lines, and the kind of decentralized command structure that secret organizations require. Other early Klan leaders had backgrounds in secret fraternal organizations. They knew how to create rituals that bound men together. They understood the psychology of secret societies, how shared secrets create loyalty stronger than law or conscience. And the Klan's rapid spread across the South followed patterns that looked less like spontaneous organization and more like activation of an existing network. It was as if someone had a list of trusted men in each county, men who could be relied upon to organize and lead, men who already knew how to operate in secret, men who had done this before. Could the Knights of the Golden Circle have simply rebranded again? Could the KGC's ideology, infrastructure, membership roles, and yes, hidden wealth have been absorbed into the Klan? There's no smoking gun. No document that says, "Dear Klan, love the Knights of the Golden Circle. Here's our member list, our operational procedures, and some gold to fund your activities." Historical conspiracies rarely leave convenient paper trails, but the circumstantial evidence is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Both organizations had essentially identical goals: preserve Southern power structures, resist federal authority by any means necessary, and maintain racial hierarchies through violence if needed. Both used secret rituals and violent intimidation as their primary tools. Both operated through decentralized cells that were difficult for authorities to infiltrate or destroy. Both had support from local elites who provided protection and resources, and both had financial resources that seemed to exceed what you'd expect from their claimed origins. Where did the early clan get its funding? Sheets and robes cost money, horses cost money, arms cost money. Coordinating across multiple states costs money. Someone was paying for all of this, and it wasn't membership dues from poor farmers. How did it spread so quickly across such a large geographic area? Who was coordinating the violence? Who was training local leaders? Who was providing the operational manuals that made different clan chapters operate so similarly? The official histories don't have good answers to these questions. Maybe because the truth was too disturbing to admit. Maybe because acknowledging a direct link between the KGC and the clan would have meant admitting that Reconstruction was facing an organised insurgency with deep roots and significant resources, not just random violence from sore losers. That would have been a terrifying admission for the federal government to make. It would have meant the Civil War hadn't really ended. It had just changed tactics. Chapter 6. The Lincoln Question. We have to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the assassination at the theatre. April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theatre in Washington, District of Columbia. The play is Our American Cousin, a comedy that's popular with wartime audiences looking for distraction. President Abraham Lincoln is in the presidential box with his wife Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. They're relaxed. The war is essentially over. Lincoln can finally breathe. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth enters the presidential box. He's an actor. He's been in this theatre many times. The staff knows him. Nobody stops him. He knows the play well enough to time his approach for a moment when the audience will be laughing, covering the sound of his entry. Booth shoots President Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. Lincoln slumps forward, mortally wounded. He'll die the next morning, never regaining consciousness. Booth leaps from the box to the stage, breaking his leg in the landing, and shouts something the witnesses can't quite agree on. Then he limps out of the theatre and disappears into the Washington night. For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth evades capture. Let that sink in. The most wanted man in America, having just committed the most significant assassination in the nation's history, manages to avoid capture for nearly 2 weeks. How? He moves through a network of safe houses. He crosses the Potomac River into Virginia. He finds people willing to hide him, feed him, treat his injuries. He has contacts, resources, and most importantly, a plan that extends beyond the assassination itself. This wasn't a spontaneous act by a lone madman. This was planned. This was coordinated. This had infrastructure behind it. Eventually, Union cavalry tracks Booth down to a tobacco barn near Bowling Green, Virginia. They surround the barn. They demand his surrender. Booth refuses. The barn is set on fire to force him out. In the chaos and smoke, a shot rings out. Booth falls, mortally wounded. He dies a few hours later. The official story is that Sergeant Boston Corbett, acting against orders, shot Booth to prevent his escape. Corbett claimed divine instruction to fire. He was never punished. Some witnesses said it looked like Booth shot himself. The truth died with everyone in that barn. The official investigation concluded that Booth was part of a conspiracy, but a relatively small one. A handful of co-conspirators, all Confederate sympathizers, acting largely on their own initiative to strike a blow against the Union government. 8 people were arrested, tried and convicted. 4 were hanged. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not really. It never has been. Researchers have spent over a century and a half picking apart Booth's movements, his contacts and his resources, and some of what they've found is genuinely troubling, raising questions that official history has never satisfactorily answered. Booth had connections to known Confederate intelligence operatives, not suspected connections, documented ones. He had travelled to Canada in the months before the Yale assassination, where Confederate agents were known to be operating. He had money. More money than an actor should have had. Where did it come from? His escape route followed pathways that matched documented Underground Railroad routes used by Southern agents during the war. Not approximately, exactly. The same houses, the same contacts, the same methods. Someone had planned this route before, tested it, confirmed it would work. The safe houses that sheltered Booth weren't random Confederate sympathisers. They had ties to secret societies and organised Southern resistance networks. Some had connections, documented in later research, to men who had been Knights of the Golden Circle members before the war. And here's the really interesting part that conspiracy researchers focus on. The assistance network Booth used looked remarkably similar to the escape tactics attributed to the Knights of the Golden Circle during the war. The organisation, the security protocols, the way information was compartmentalised so that each link in the chain only knew the next step, not the whole plan. This is sophisticated tradecraft. This is how intelligence organisations operate. This isn't how a random group of angry Southerners would organise an assassination plot. Did the Knights help plan Lincoln's assassination? Did they provide Booth with resources, training and support? Were they part of a larger plot to decapitate the Union government and create chaos that might somehow revive Confederate hopes? The conspiracy theorists point to several disturbing coincidences. The assassination happened just days after Lee's surrender, when Confederate cause was clearly lost. Why then? If it was about changing the war's outcome, it was too late. But if it was about revenge, or about creating a martyred president whose death would poison Reconstruction and benefit Southern resistance, then the timing makes perfect sense. Official investigations never proved KGC involvement. They never even seriously investigated it. But they also never fully ruled it out. The evidence was circumstantial, fragmentary, and often destroyed or lost. What we're left with is a question mark, a big one. And the more you look at the details, the more you notice the gaps in the official story, the bigger that question mark becomes. Chapter 7. The 20th Century Ghosts. You might think that by the 1900s the Knights of the Golden Circle would be ancient history. A relic of the Civil War era, as dead as the Confederacy itself, something that belonged in dusty archives and academic dissertations, not in the living world. But strange things kept happening. Little things, easily dismissed individually but disturbing when you see them as a pattern. Throughout the early 20th century, occasional reports surfaced that didn't quite make sense. Men in small southern towns identifying themselves as knights to people they thought they could trust. Why would anyone claim membership in a defunct organisation unless it wasn't actually defunct? Old Confederate symbols appearing in unexpected places, carved into the foundations of new buildings, or incorporated into business logos in ways that seemed deliberately coded. Bank records tied to defunct Southern trusts that seemed to have more money than they should, funds that appeared to grow over time rather than depleting. In 1934, something happened in Oklahoma that encapsulates the entire mystery. A man named William, a carpenter and amateur historian, was renovating an old house that had supposedly been built by a Confederate veteran. He was tearing out a wall when he found something hidden in the cavity between the studs. A map, hand-drawn on aged paper, sealed in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The map showed local landmarks, some of which still existed, others that William had to research to identify, and it was covered in symbols, hearts, turtles, owls, the same symbols that had been appearing on treasure maps and stone markers for 70 years. William was excited. He was careful. He didn't immediately announce his find to the world. He showed it to a few trusted friends. He started researching the symbols, trying to decode them. He planned an expedition to some of the marked locations. He was methodical, thoughtful, doing everything right. 3 weeks later, William was found dead in his home. The official cause of death was listed as heart attack. He was 32 years old, in good health, with no family history of heart problems. He'd been working in his garage when it happened, apparently. Alone. No witnesses. The map disappeared. When William's widow looked for it among his possessions, it was gone. She knew he'd been keeping it in a locked drawer in his workshop. The drawer was still locked. The map wasn't there, she never reported it missing. When researchers tried to interview her years later about her husband's death, she refused to discuss it. She was afraid, decades after the fact. You could see it in her eyes, people said. She was still afraid. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the century. Someone finds something, maybe an old map, maybe a journal, maybe carved symbols on their property. They get excited, they tell people, they start investigating. Then suddenly they don't want to talk anymore. Or they can't. In 1957, a man in Arkansas claimed he'd found a carved stone with KGC symbols while clearing land. He brought it to the local historical society, excited to share his discovery. The society photographed it, documented it, and asked if they could keep it for further study. He agreed. 2 weeks later, he returned and demanded the stone back, visibly shaken. The society returned it. He destroyed it with a sledgehammer in the parking lot, then left and never spoke of it again. Historical society members later said he looked terrified, like someone had put a genuine fear into him. In 1973, a construction crew in East Texas accidentally uncovered what appeared to be a small buried vault while excavating for a shopping centre foundation. Inside were Confederate coins, personal effects, and documents. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid. The crew foreman called the site supervisor. The supervisor made some phone calls. Within hours, men in suits arrived and took control of the site. The crew was told to forget what they'd seen, and were given substantial bonuses to ensure their silence. The vault and its contents disappeared. The shopping centre was built. To this day, nobody knows what happened to the artefacts or who those men in suits were. The treasure hunters who survived these encounters learned an important lesson. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media, though that didn't exist for most of this history. You don't give interviews. You don't write books. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land, and you hope nobody asks too many questions. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why this particular cache has gone undiscovered for over 100 years. Why no one else has found it, and whether maybe, just maybe, it was left unfound for a reason. Whether someone is still keeping track, still watching, still guarding secrets their great-great-grandfathers swore to protect. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades, the ones who are still alive and still willing to talk, they all tell similar stories. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match documented KGC codes. The location makes historical sense. They'll plan an expedition. And then someone shows up. Could be a friendly local who warns them the property owner is litigious. Could be someone claiming to represent historical preservation interests. Could be people who don't bother with explanations, who just make it very clear through body language and implication that moving along would be the smart choice. It happens too often to be coincidence, too consistently across too many years in too many locations to be random chance. Chapter 8. The Gaps That Remain Here's the fundamental problem with the Knights of the Golden Circle story, and it's a problem that should bother anyone who values historical truth. We know they existed. That's not in dispute. We have membership rolls recovered from raids during the Civil War. We have meeting minutes captured by Union forces. We have contemporary newspaper accounts describing their activities. We have court documents from wartime trials of suspected members. The Knights of the Golden Circle were real. We know they were large, well-organised, and had significant influence in southern and border states. That's also thoroughly documented. Estimates of 40 to 60,000 members aren't wild speculation. They're based on captured documents, testimony from defectors, and Union intelligence reports compiled by people with no reason to exaggerate. We know they had money. Membership dues, sure, but also backing from wealthy southern planters and businessmen who saw the organisation as serving their interests. They had the resources to publish newspapers, fund expeditions, and maintain a network of meeting halls across multiple states. What we don't know is what happened to them after the war, and that gap in the historical record isn't just suspicious, it's gaping. It's the kind of hole that swallows entire conspiracy theories, and still has room for more. Most KGC documents were destroyed. Whether deliberately or through the chaos of war, the organisation's records largely vanished. We're not talking about a few missing ledgers. We're talking about entire archives that should exist but don't. Membership rolls that should list thousands of names just gone. Financial records that should show where money came from and where it went disappeared. Correspondence that should reveal the organisation's plans and operations destroyed or lost. Confederate files were burned as Richmond fell. That's documented. The Confederate government ordered the destruction of sensitive documents to prevent them from falling into Union hands. But which documents were considered most sensitive? Which were prioritised for destruction? Were KGC files among them? We don't know, because the records of what was destroyed were also destroyed. Post-war America had powerful reasons to bury the past and move forward. The country was exhausted, hundreds of thousands dead, the economy shattered, the social order completely upended. There was a genuine, understandable desire to just stop fighting and start rebuilding. Admitting that a large, well-funded secret society had survived the war and might still be operating would have been devastating to that effort. It would undermine everything Reconstruction was trying to accomplish. It would expose federal failures to control domestic threats. It would raise uncomfortable questions about missing Confederate assets and who might have access to them. It would suggest that the war hadn't really ended, just changed forms. So the official story became simple, clean, reassuring. The Knights of the Golden Circle were a pre-war conspiracy that faded away when their dreams of a southern empire died at Appomattox. They disbanded. Their members went home. Some joined other organisations like the Klan, but the KGC itself ceased to exist. End of story. Clean, simple, reassuring. Probably not true, because here's what doesn't make sense about that narrative. Organisations don't usually announce when they disband, especially secret organisations. They don't take out newspaper ads saying the Knights of the Golden Circle are officially dissolved, thank you for your support. They just go quiet. And going quiet doesn't mean ceasing to exist. It just means becoming invisible. And there's another problem with the official narrative. The Knights had been planning for Confederate defeat since at least 1863, possibly earlier. There's evidence of this in captured correspondence. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a protracted struggle. They were hiding resources and building networks designed to survive military defeat. Why would an organisation that had spent years preparing for defeat suddenly give up the moment defeat actually came? That's not how groups work, especially groups built on ideology and bound by blood oaths. The more logical explanation is that they did exactly what they'd been planning to do. They went underground, they protected their resources, they waited, and maybe, just maybe, they're still waiting. Chapter 9. The question that won't die. Let's lay out what we know for certain. The Knights of the Golden Circle existed as a large organised secret society before and during the Civil War. Fact. Large amounts of Confederate gold and assets disappeared at the end of the war with no clear accounting. Fact. Treasure markers and coded symbols appeared across the South in the decades following the war. Fact. People who investigated these markers often met with mysterious deaths or intimidation. Fact. The early Ku Klux Klan emerged with a structure and spread pattern that resembled earlier Confederate secret societies. Fact. What we don't know is how these facts connect, and that's where it gets interesting. If the Knights of the Golden Circle really did plan for Confederate defeat, if they really did hide massive wealth, if they really did embed themselves into post-war American society, then we have to ask some uncomfortable questions. How long did they survive? What did they become? Did they evolve into something else? Or did they eventually fade away? If the gold still exists, who's guarding it now? And here's the most disturbing possibility. What if they never went away at all? What if the Knights of the Golden Circle simply learned to operate in the shadows, influencing events without drawing attention, maintaining their network across generations? Secret societies don't usually announce when they disband. They just stop being visible. That doesn't mean they stop existing. Chapter 10. The evidence in the ground. There's a reason treasure hunters are still looking for KGC gold, and it's not just fantasy or delusion or the appeal of a romantic mystery. Real discoveries have been made. Documented discoveries. the kind that make it into newspapers and legal proceedings because people have to figure out who owns what and how much tax is owed. In the 1980s, a man in Arkansas whose name was never publicly released found a cache of gold coins buried on property he'd recently purchased. The coins were genuine Civil War-era gold, worth a small fortune even at face value, worth much more to collectors, and they were buried in a very specific pattern, arranged in a way that matched documented KGC symbols. This wasn't random. This wasn't some Confederate soldier burying his pay. This was organised, intentional, and coded. The man did everything right legally. He reported the find to authorities. He paid taxes on the value. He worked with archaeologists to document the site properly. And then he never said another word about where exactly he found it, or what else might be out there. When reporters tried to follow up, he refused all interviews. When treasure hunters tried to trace the location based on public records, they hit dead ends. The man knew what he'd found, reported enough to stay legal, and then sealed his mouth shut. Why? What did he know? What did he suspect? Did someone approach him? Did he figure out on his own that staying quiet was the smart choice? In the 1990s, a construction crew in Texas, working on a highway expansion project, accidentally uncovered a stone vault. This wasn't a treasure hunter's fantasy. This was heavy equipment operated by workers who didn't care about Civil War history. They just wanted to finish the job and go home. The vault was about 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, sealed with mortar that had held for over a century. Inside, they found Confederate currency, personal effects including letters and a diary, and various items that indicated this had been buried by someone with means and connections. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid, not painted, not scratched, carved deep, meant to last, meant to identify to those who knew the code. The contents were turned over to local historians and eventually ended up in a museum collection. But here's the interesting part. The exact location of the find was never publicly disclosed. The construction records show a general area, but not specific coordinates. When asked why, state officials cited concerns about treasure hunters and site preservation. But the site was under a highway. There was no site left to preserve. What were they really protecting? These aren't urban legends. These are documented finds with paperwork, witnesses, and physical artifacts, which means the rumours weren't all fantasy. Something really was buried out there. The question is, how much and who knows where? In 2007, a metal detecting hobbyist in Kentucky found a sealed mason jar containing gold coins and a document on private property with the owner's permission. The document was a letter, dated 1866, with what appeared to be coded instructions. The letter referenced the circle and mentioned that what is buried shall remain until the time is right. The gold coins alone were worth over $30,000. The letter has never been fully decoded, though several cryptographers have tried. The finder split the proceeds with the property owner as agreed. They both signed non-disclosure agreements at the advice of their lawyers, which seems like an odd thing to do over a jar of old coins unless someone was worried about something more than taxes. And here's something that should make you think. In almost every documented case of KGC-related treasure being found, the finders either stay quiet afterward or face mysterious pressure to stop looking, stop talking, stop investigating. It's not every time. Some people find old coins and that's the end of it. But when the find includes KGC symbols, when it appears to be part of a larger pattern, when it suggests there's more out there, that's when things get strange. That's when people start getting careful about what they say. Chapter 11. The Map That Can't Be Read. Here's something that genuinely haunts researchers who study the KGC. Something that keeps them up at night turning over possibilities in their minds. Authentic treasure maps allegedly created by the Knights do exist in various museums and private collections across the South. They've been authenticated as period documents by multiple experts. The paper is right, matching paper stock from the 1860s. The ink is right, consistent with iron gall ink used during the Civil War era. The handwriting matches known Confederate styles and shows the characteristic flourishes of educated men from that period. These aren't obvious forgeries created by modern hoaxers. These are genuine 19th century documents, but they can't be read. And that's the problem that's driven cryptographers and treasure hunters to distraction for over a century. The maps use a cipher system that has never been fully cracked. Symbols that might represent landmarks, distances or directions, but without a key, without the codebook or verbal instructions that would have been passed between members. They're just intricate drawings. Beautiful, precise, maddeningly useless drawings. Some researchers have spent entire careers trying to decode these maps. They've applied every known cipher technique from the 1800s. They've tried substitution ciphers, where each symbol represents a letter or number. They've tried transposition ciphers, where the symbols need to be rearranged according to a pattern. They've tried book ciphers, where the symbols might reference specific words in well-known texts like the Bible or Shakespeare. Nothing works completely. They can make educated guesses. They can extrapolate based on geographical knowledge and historical context. They can sometimes identify what might be a church or a river or a crossroads, but they can't definitively read the maps from start to finish. They can't follow the instructions the way the original knights would have. And here's what makes it even more frustrating. The cipher system appears to be multi-layered. Some symbols seem to be straightforward landmarks. A church might be indicated by a cross, a river by wavy lines. But then other symbols are clearly coded, and the code itself might vary from map to map, suggesting that different castles or different members use different variants of the base system. It's brilliant security when you think about it. Even if someone captured a map, even if they understood that it led to buried treasure, they couldn't follow it without additional knowledge. Knowledge that would have been passed down verbally from member to member, perhaps through the initiation rituals or through private instruction from castle leaders to their most trusted subordinates. It's the perfect security system for its time. A treasure map that requires human knowledge to interpret. Knowledge that might have died with its keepers as the organisation aged, and members passed away without proper successors. Or knowledge that might still be held by someone somewhere who knows exactly what they're protecting and why. And here's the really interesting thing that comes up when you talk to modern cryptographers who've worked on these maps. They say the cipher system shows signs of being deliberately designed to be unbreakable without the key. It's not just complex. It's structured in a way that prevents pattern analysis from working. The symbols don't repeat in predictable ways. There aren't enough examples to do frequency analysis. It's as if whoever designed the system understood the principles of cryptography well enough to build in defences against the standard code-breaking techniques. Where did a group of southern conspirators in the 1850s and 60s get that kind of expertise? Some members had military training, sure, but this is more sophisticated than military field codes of that era. Some researchers speculate that KGC leaders studied European secret society traditions, borrowing techniques from groups like the Freemasons or even older organisations. Or maybe they just had someone in the organisation who was genuinely brilliant at creating codes. Someone whose identity we'll never know because the records burned with Richmond. Chapter 12. The Modern Search. Today, there's a subculture of treasure hunters, historians, and conspiracy enthusiasts who are still looking for KGC gold. They compare notes online, they share theories, they make expeditions into remote areas of the South with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. Most find nothing. Some find bottles and old nails. A few find things they won't talk about publicly. Because here's what they've learned. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media. You don't give interviews. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why no one else has found this in over 150 years, and whether maybe it was left unfound for a reason. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades tell the same story. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match. The location makes sense. They'll plan an expedition, and then someone shows up. Could be a local property owner, could be someone claiming historical preservation concerns, could be people who just make it clear they should move along. It happens too often to be coincidence. Final chapter. What if it's true? Let's do a thought experiment. Let's say everything the conspiracy theorists claim is true. The Knights of the Golden Circle survived the Civil War. They hid massive amounts of Confederate wealth. They evolved, adapted, and maintained their organisation across generations. What would that mean? It would mean there's a secret society, over 150 years old, sitting on a fortune in gold and historical artefacts. It would mean they've successfully stayed hidden while the world changed completely around them. It would mean they've passed down knowledge, rituals and responsibilities through multiple generations. It would mean they're still out there. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying it's what some people believe happened, and the reason they believe it is because the alternative explanations have gaps you could drive a truck through. Where did the Confederate gold go? It was lost doesn't really answer the question when witnesses say it was deliberately hidden. Why do treasure markers appear across the South? It's a hoax doesn't explain why people keep dying when they find them. How did the early Klan spread so quickly with such sophisticated organisation? Confederate veterans is a vague answer that doesn't account for the resources involved. The official history has gaps. The conspiracy theory fills those gaps. Maybe not correctly, but it fills them with a narrative that's at least coherent. Epilogue. The truth we'll never know. Here's what I believe after researching this topic for hours and hours, after reading everything I could find, after talking to treasure hunters and historians and people who've spent their lives chasing these shadows. The Knights of the Golden Circle were absolutely real. They were large, influential and genuinely dangerous. They absolutely played a significant role in pushing the South toward a secession and supporting the Confederate cause during the Civil War. That's not speculation. That's documented historical fact. I also believe that Confederate gold was deliberately hidden at the end of the war. Not all of it. Probably not even most of it. A lot of Confederate wealth really was lost to chaos, stolen by deserters, or seized by Union forces. But significant amounts, meaningful amounts, were deliberately cached by people who hoped and believed the South would rise again and need those resources. This also isn't wild speculation. We have witness testimony, we have documented discoveries, we have too many consistent accounts across too many years to dismiss it all as fantasy. Were those people members of the KGC? Probably some of them were. The KGC was the most organised, most sophisticated secret society in the Confederacy. They had the structure, the discipline and the ideology to carry out long-term plans. It makes perfect logical sense they'd be involved in any plan to hide assets and prepare for a protracted resistance. Did they survive as an organisation after the war? That's where it gets murky, where the facts blur into speculation and possibility. I think elements of the KGC probably did persist for a while, maybe even for decades. The infrastructure was there, the ideology was there, the motivation was certainly there. Organisations don't just evaporate when they lose a war, especially organisations built on blood oaths and shared secrets. But did they maintain the same structure and goals as the war years? Did they evolve into something else, something adapted to the changed reality of post-war America? Did they eventually just fade away as members died, and their secrets died with them, as the world changed too much for their antebellum dreams to make any sense? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's the frustrating and fascinating thing about this story. What I do know is that treasure hunters are still finding things, not in huge numbers, but consistently enough that it can't all be dismissed. Symbols are still carved in stone across the South, weathered but visible if you know where to look. And people who know the history, who've studied it deeply, still get uncomfortable when you start asking questions about certain locations. There's still something there, whether it's actual buried gold or just the cultural memory of secrets that were real once. I can't say for certain. Something happened in the 1860s. The evidence is there in archives and museums. The gaps in the historical record are there in what's missing from those same archives. The unanswered questions are there in every documentary find that raises 10 new questions. Maybe the truth is mundane. A bunch of Confederate sympathisers buried some gold with the best of intentions. They drew maps and carved markers, but time passed. They died. Their children didn't care about the old cause. The markers eroded. Development covered burial sites. The treasure either doesn't exist in meaningful quantities anymore, or is lost forever, buried under highways and shopping centres and suburban sprawl. That's one possibility. It's a reasonable possibility. It might even be the truth. Or maybe the truth is stranger. Maybe there really is a network of guardians, not an organised secret society like the original Knights, but a tradition passed down through certain families. Knowledge that great-great-grandfather was trusted with something important. A sense of duty to protect what was hidden, even if the original cause is long dead and the gold itself matters less than the principle of keeping faith with the past. I can't tell you which it is. I can only tell you that the Knights of the Golden Circle definitely existed. They had the means, motive, and opportunity to hide Confederate wealth. They planned for defeat and prepared for a long struggle, and over a century and a half later, people are still looking for what they left behind, still finding markers and symbols, still encountering mysteries that resist easy explanation. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the mystery itself is the legacy. Not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories, but the reminder that history has gaps, that the official story is often incomplete, that there are always secrets just beneath the surface of what we think we know. Closing thoughts. Were the Knights of the Golden Circle just a failed Confederate relic? A historical footnote about Southern extremists who dreamed too big and lost? Or were they America's first true underground power network? An organisation that planned for the long game, that hid resources and embedded themselves so deeply in post-war society that they became invisible? And if the gold still exists, sitting in caves or buried under farmland or hidden in places no one has looked for 150 years, who's guarding it now? Is it still being guarded at all? Or has time finally won, and the secrets of the Knights of the Golden Circle died with the last generation that knew them? I don't have answers, just questions. And the more you dig into this story, the more questions you'll have too. So maybe that's the real legacy of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories. Just questions that won't die. Gaps in history that won't be filled. Symbols carved in stone that no one alive can fully interpret. And treasure hunters still walking into the woods, looking for something that might not want to be found. Thanks for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most persistent mysteries, please consider supporting the channel. Use those hype points. Leave that Spotify review. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We genuinely love seeing where this content reaches, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. We've got more stories like this coming, more gaps in history that need exploring, more questions that deserve to be asked. Until next time, sleep well. And if you're ever hiking in the Georgia wilderness and you see a stone with a turtle carved into it, maybe just keep walking. Some secrets have stayed buried this long for a reason. Good night.